Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to start with the harsh, ridiculous, and very real world of medieval duels, where the expression settling things like men meant that you might die over a chicken, a drink that was spilled, or a poorly directed insult. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. You are accused of stealing a cow by someone in your town, or they may claim that you have insulted their honor, or worse, cast doubt on their ancestry. There were several approaches to dealing with this in medieval Europe. The first option, talking it out like responsible adults, never works. We're currently discussing option 2, which is to challenge them to a duel. When paperwork was limited and tempers were not, the preferred legal method of resolving disagreements was trial by battle. In theory, the idea was admirable. Let two people battle it out, and the victor would undoubtedly be telling the truth, as God would never permit a liar to prevail in a sword fight. God avoided most of these, spoiler alert. At best, the rules, if we can call them that, were vague. Depending on the social class and the level of sophistication of the occasion, you were expected to use the same weapon in some areas, such as clubs, axes, or swords. In others, excitement was more important than standardization. While your opponent has just a boiled leather vest and hope, you could arrive with a full set of armor. The scene? Not nearly the combat on a foggy cliff from a movie. Usually, it was a town square, a muddy field, or any other area of terrain that was level enough for swinging objects. These bouts were not graceful, and occasionally spectators attended for amusement purposes only, not for fairness. Shakespearean speeches and elegant fencing are out of the question. Medieval dueling was uncomfortable, humid, and draining. Wheezing through metal grills, two people in heavy gear clanking around in the hopes that the other one will stumble in the mud first. It's interesting to see that killing the other person wasn't always necessary. The duel might finish if they gave up, perhaps by moaning into the ground or perhaps by making a loud uncle noise. If they didn't, however, the combat might go on until one of them ceased to move in a convincing manner. Yes, there have been recorded instances of women and men engaging in dueling, sometimes under adapted rules. For example, a guy may have been battling from a pit, while a woman held a club above him. At least someone was attempting to level the playing field, which may sound strange. Literally. Let's go back to the early medieval era, when legal systems were less of a concrete foundation and more of a courteous suggestion. You wouldn't employ a lawyer if someone accused you of being secretly French, stealing a pig, or insulting their honor. You asked God to choose a side and sharpened something sharp. Thus began the graceful practice of trial by combat, in which the ability to swing a sword without instantly toppling over proved the truth rather than facts. The belief that the gods, and later God, with a capital G, would never allow an innocent man to lose a battle was first held by Germanic tribes such as the Franks. You might have 3 goats too many, lie and cheat. However, it was anticipated that heavenly justice would step in once the swords were drawn. Finally, hopefully, except when God was eating lunch. There were other legal ordeals than trial by fight. Additionally, there was a trial by fire. Keep this hot iron with you and pray your skin doesn't melt. And a water trial. You are guilty if you float. You're innocent if you sink, but you might die. However, there was a certain elegance to trial by battle. It was loud, theatrical, and gave you the semblance that expertise was important. The idea gained so much traction over time that it began to appear in official legal laws. According to the medieval counterpart of the Lex Aliminorum and Lex Salica, which my uncle wrote down, therefore it must be lawful, you can challenge someone to a duel if they accuse you of lying and you're feeling very hostile. In order to avoid embarrassing your ancestors, please bring your own weapons. Trial by fight had made its way into medieval courts by the 12th century. It was utilized by nobility to settle property disputes, marital charges, and other situations that needed a spectacular conclusion. There were rules. Since duels needed a judge's approval, someone in robes and a hat had to say, "Yes, you may now try to legally bludgeon each other." The finest aspect? You were automatically guilty if you didn't fight. Therefore, you had the option of going straight to jail or picking up a weapon and praying for heavenly help. Or worse, a return to the life of a peasant. Imagine a hero with flowing plumes, imposing armor, and brave gaze. Imagine that same knight, struggling to breathe, trying to pull a grown man out of a mud pool, as a squire holds their horse and acts as though they are not emotionally damaged. Greetings from the land of knightly duels, where cooperation was optional, but honor was at stake. Knight-on-knight combat was considered a civilized activity. According to the code of chivalry, you should battle with bravery, justice, and moderation. However, the majority of that went out the arrow slit after the helmets were on, and the visibility was almost completely obscured. The altercation abruptly devolved into a clumsy, noisy brawl between two armored barrels. Both sides would air their complaints prior to the game. These varied from your dog staring at me strangely to you insulting my aristocratic house. The occasion was supervised by judges or nobility, who pretended that it was a very respectable affair rather than a matter of professional resentment. The agreed-upon weapons were typically long swords, maces, or lances, but occasionally it seemed more like picking whatever was laying about. Sometimes fighters would even switch weapons in the middle of a battle, generally as a result of panicking and dropping their initial weapon. The armor was modified to be suitable for dueling. This required additional plate around the head, chest, ego, and other key areas, with the occasional spike or two added for show. However, mobility was negatively impacted. It was like seeing two stuffed closets tumble down a staircase, loud, slow, and full of unanticipated injuries when two knights fought. The majority of these duels did not conclude with a quick, honorable blow, as romantic paintings would have us believe. When one knight passed out from exhaustion or was wrestled to the ground and gently bludgeoned into compliance, they came to an end. With a mouthful of helmet, one would occasionally yell, "I yield," hoping that someone could hear him over the wheezing and clanking. It wasn't always necessary to kill your opponent to win a duel. Indeed, it might be considered improper to kill them, particularly if the incident began over something insignificant, such as a dropped glove or an insult that was misheard. Nobody wanted to tell the king why Sir Geoffrey had changed his name to Fertilizer. Not all duels took place between shining, armored nobility. When two peasants were fighting over anything major, such as who got to use the only working plough or who spilled whose beer 3 market days ago, justice had to be rendered. Additionally, there is only one way to resolve a dispute if you are a medieval peasant. Shout 2, throw something, or 3. Duel with the nearest, vaguely pointy object. Greetings from the realm of peasant duels. Less resources, same fury. Peasants, in contrast to knights, were unable to purchase specialized armor, expensive weapons, or a meeting with the local lord. The majority of duels took place behind the alehouse, in alleys, or in fields, locations that are already covered with muck, animal feces, and the odd, unconscious observer. It has nothing to do with show. It had to do with pride, and possibly a chicken. The armaments? Imaginative. Heavy rocks, soup ladles, kitchen knives, sticks, hoes, and pitchforks. It qualified if it could be raised and swung with feeling. Some even fought while using farming implements that were still coated in turnip from the previous day. A man was allegedly hit with a wheel of cheese to halt one altercation. It's not a legend, it's only Tuesday. Formal rules were unusual. The majority of battles began on their own and ended when one man gave up, fainted, or wandered off board. Sometimes an inebriated uncle or village elder would act as referee, a position that mainly consisted yelling, "That's enough, lads," while clutching a half-eaten apple. These duels weren't always viewed negatively, despite the mayhem. Some cultures viewed a good, clean fight as therapeutic, similar to medieval counseling, except that you used a shovel to try to dislocate someone's shoulder rather than discussing your feelings. Naturally, not every altercation ended amicably. On rare occasions, someone did suffer a catastrophic injury or pass away, generally from shame or a head wound. At that point, local officials intervened to remind everyone that unless a noble or deity had given their prior approval, killing was typically discouraged. Nevertheless, in a society with few rights and even fewer coping strategies, peasant duels provided an essential outlet. They were noisy, untidy, and illogical, just like life in those days. And you might win the argument, which was essentially the same thing to a medieval peasant, as winning land, honor, or a title. Your weapon said a lot about you in medieval dueling. It conveyed to your adversary your seriousness, wealth, and, in certain situations, the recent interruption while preparing stew. Let's begin with the traditional songs. The preferred weapon of knights and wealthy squires was the long sword. It had a striking appearance, was well balanced, and had the potential to settle a fight, or at the very least, leave your opponent's armor with a memorable dent. You were essentially declaring, "I've trained for this," and possibly own land if you arrived brandishing a longsword. The mace, a cute little instrument made just for bludgeoning someone through their armor, came next. The mace didn't care about style. Similar to a hammer in the Middle Ages, it was violent, useful, and not very good at conveying subtle messages. Axes were also widely used, particularly by individuals who liked to fight with a little lumberjack flair. Depending on how spectacular you wanted your arrival to be, some were one-handed and some were two-handed. There was something about axes. It's like slinging what was formerly a firewood tool at someone's helmet. Nothing conveys that this is personal. It's time for the imaginative submissions. You used whatever was laying around to fight if you were a peasant. Sticks, hoes, wooden clubs, pitchforks, and yes, even a frying pan now and then. There are documented instances of someone bringing utensils to a battle. One man famously brandished a skillet with such ferocity that most likely under extraordinary bludgeonings, the local priest noted it in the parish ledger. Daggers were also widely used for work in close quarters. Some were exalted sharp triangles, while others were smooth. Daggers allow you to settle disputes in confined areas, such as pub cellars or castle hallways, without upending too many chairs. You might arrive with a flail, the notorious chain and ball device, if you truly wanted to make an impression. Flails were ominous, threatening, and almost impossible to aim correctly. You don't see flail specialists anymore for a reason. The majority of them exhaust themselves. One might assume that the medieval church, a stronghold of piety, peace, and moral instruction, would be adamantly opposed to the notion of people using sticks, swords, or cast-iron cookware to settle disputes. You'd be partially correct. Theoretically, the church disapproved of violence. In reality, their stance on duels was, to put it mildly, more dependent than not. Combat trial was once a sacred idea. It was believed that God would guarantee victory for the righteous side. After all, who could swing harder without toppling over? That's the best method to find out the truth. Before a duel, priests would frequently bless the fighters, not to dissuade them, but to ensure that God had the right paperwork in order. Formal duels, particularly those authorized by courts, were often supervised by church officials. There was even a monk who kept score, though not formally. It was merely interesting to him. The reasoning was straightforward. God obviously preferred a man more if he survived the duel. God's judgment had spoken if he didn't. Additionally, the choir suddenly had a vacancy. but not all members of the church agreed. Trial by combat was occasionally outlawed by popes who deemed it to be barbarous, unchristian, and unbecoming of Sunday attendance. Nobles in particular, who had a talent for only listening to church pronouncements when they agreed with them, largely disregarded these prohibitions. Paradoxically, monasteries weren't exactly places free from violence either. Monks have been known to quarrel about gardening equipment, borrowing books, and choir responsibilities. In one especially heated argument, a novice monk threw a psalter at someone's head, the weaponization of divine inspiration. The unpredictability of duels was the church's biggest issue, not the violence. Occasionally the wrong person prevailed, and nothing undermines divine authority more than God's support for the man who hasn't confessed in 6 years and smells like ale. Clergy eventually started advocating for less trial by axe and trial by witness testimony as judicial systems developed and victims continued to bleed on church grounds. However, the church maintained a safe distance in the interim, close enough to bless the battle, but far enough away to avoid accidental stabbings, because the bruises were instantaneous, but forgiveness was eternal. Don't believe that medieval dueling was only for boys. In the cabbage field, the mud pit, or the ring, women also occasionally entered, and when they did, things got complex. Medieval society, you see, had quite particular views regarding women, humble, delicate, and not the best person to handle head traumas in public. Occasionally, however, a lady had had enough, and the duel left the audience perplexed, and both sides bruised. The most well-known instance is from Germany in the 14th century, when local law permitted a woman to challenge a man, but only under certain restrictions. The individual was required to stand with one arm tied behind his back in a waist-deep trench. A club was handed to the woman, who was standing above the ground. Though the entire situation feels more like a carnival game than a court case, he also received one, apparently to be fair. Nevertheless, it did occur several times. Imagine it. A lady makes systematic strokes from above, stopping occasionally to fix her apron, while a man, half buried in a pit, spins slowly in circles with a club. A throng of bystanders celebrate in what can only be described as passive-aggressive, or as a woman knocks a man down in one German woodcut. Although they were uncommon, these duels were permitted. A champion, typically a brother, cousin, or someone she hadn't previously irritated, may be chosen by women to battle in their honor. She was taken seriously, though, if she stood up for herself. Nobody was permitted to step in. You were guilty if you lost, and degraded, most likely both. Of course, women's anger had other outlets besides dueling. Women's feuds frequently took place in less structured ways. There were poisonings, rumors of witchcraft, and the odd shoe-throwing incident at the marketplace. Occasionally, however, the system recognized that a lady had the right to use a swing to resolve a dispute. For medieval civilization, these were uncomfortable times. It was not expected of women to be aggressive, violent, or triumphant. And yet here they were, club in hand, altering someone's shoulder while protecting their reputation. Medieval duels might seem like they can't get any more ridiculous. A pig is then placed on trial by someone. Indeed it is. Animals were sometimes considered legal persons in a world where legal institutions were kept together by divine assumption, duct tape, and Latin, which implied that they might face criminal charges, and disciplined, and challenged to a duel in certain instances. Let's be clear, formal fights were uncommon in animal duels. They were more like paper-based executions. They might be arrested if a rooster crowed suspiciously at the wrong time, or if a pig bit a youngster, even wearing little clothing at times, because nothing conveys justice more than degrading animals before executing them. At times, however, the situation became more serious and confrontational. In the 15th century, a man and dog engaged in a very bizarre duel in France. After allegedly attacking his master, the dog reportedly sought refuge in a monastery. Because this was evidently a possibility, a public arena served as the venue for the duel. He was fully armored, the canine was furry, the dog prevailed, the audience applauded, and no, we're not sure how the father told his descendants that. Then there is the issue of combat animals that have been trained. In fictitious combat shows, felons are pitted against horses, mastiffs, and even the occasional bear. Legally speaking, these weren't duels, however they were aggressive and in the open. Additionally, someone always lost. The man without fur and teeth is usually the one. Why all of this? Well, the world was viewed as a carefully balanced moral system in medieval thought. A pig might sin just as easily as a human. Why couldn't a goat stand trial if a man could? And anything with limbs was fair game if justice required violence. Was this fair? Not precisely. Was it a metaphor? Apparently. Was it strange? Of course. Rarely do these situations occur. They weren't satire, though. They are mentioned in important theological discussions, illustrated in medieval manuscripts, and recorded in court documents. A monk once had to determine whether a donkey was exhibiting demonic behavior or was simply having a rough Tuesday. Jousting, or dueling on horseback, was perhaps the most dramatic of all the ways medieval people used sharp tools to make their points. It had elements of ceremony, sport, and I hope my helmet fits. And it was all predicated on the notion that the truth will eventually be exposed by two men brandishing lances at one another. Knights were mostly responsible for jostling, armor, a horse, a couple of squires, and the kind of money that allowed you to risk spinal damage for amusement were all necessary. Not your typical peasant boy with a shovel and a grudge, to put it another way. It has a straightforward format. Two knights attempted to knock each other off with long, heavy lances as they rode at one another from opposing ends of a tilt, a long wooden barrier. In order to hit your opponent squarely and break your lance dramatically while remaining upright, that was the aim. Avoiding falling from your horse like a sack of mail was the secondary objective. It was still a duel, and people were hurt in spite of the pomp. The fun included fractured bones, concussions, and the occasional impalement. One knight even suffered a fractured lance tip that became stuck in his brain and eye. Before he fell off, he rode another 100 feet. There were rules, many of them because medieval decorum required you to complete your round before you passed out. Killing someone wasn't encouraged, but depending on the audience, it wasn't completely discouraged either. You could only shoot at specific body areas. Additionally, your horse needed to be well trained, well protected, and ideally not in a bad temper. However, some equestrian duels weren't for fun. In some cases, particularly between aristocrats, horse combat was a legitimate means of resolving disagreements. Imagine a courtroom drama, only with a lot more yelling. Not everyone was gracious, of course. Riders dropped lances as horses frightened. Sometimes someone received a face full of wood because they failed to drop their visor. Although the display may have appeared honorable, most jousts concluded with a group of anxious squires and one extremely critical stable lad helping someone off the field. Between legend, blood sport, and unintentional theatre, duels subtly became one of the most popular activities in medieval Europe. For if there was anything the medieval audience enjoyed more than public executions and miracle plays, it was two irate men striking each other in the name of honor, while the others munched on roasted turnips. By the 13th century, the purpose of duels had expanded beyond settling conflicts. They were occasions, villages would congregate, guests were invited by nobles, merchants offered food for sale. There was even music at times. It was more of a medieval fight night than a grievance settlement. All socio-economic strata were drawn to duels, from nobles in velvet trying to hide their excitement to peasants standing in the dirt. Clergymen were also there, both formally for prayer and informally for wagering. God, after all, works in strange ways, yet occasionally he works in the favor of the person who has superior feet. Large open spaces, town squares, castle courtyards, or designated dueling grounds were frequently used for duels. Beer flowed, bread was tossed, and temporary stands were erected, sometimes aimed at the combatants, and the crowd was raptly attentive to every swing, grunt, and slippage as the fight began. There were applause for a clean hit, gasps for a dramatic tumble, and you can sure that if someone lost a finger, the tale was told in bars for the next 6 winters. Not only was the violence entertaining, but the personalities were as well. A few duelists were well known: the brash young squire, the weathered veteran of battle, the man who once lost a battle with a goose. The drama, the spectacle, and the chance that someone may trip over their own blade and become a local legend were what drew people in. At times, fighting was so unimpressive that the spectators turned against both sides. There was booing, tomatoes while they're in season. According to one chronicler, a throng stormed the field and declared a sheep the moral winner after the 2 men declined to engage in combat for more than 20 minutes. The duel eventually shifted from being about the truth to being more about the program. It demonstrated that justice only needed to be noisy, untidy, and ideally shirtless. It didn't need to be effective. Why not invite everyone in the town and make a big deal out of it if you're going to resolve a legal dispute? Not every duel was a fight over who stole whose bucket in a local tavern. As everyone else stood around acting as though it meant more than it actually did, some were legendary affairs, remembered not only for the bruises but also for genuinely influencing or at least slightly altering historical events. Consider the 1386 duel between Jacques Legris and Jean de Carouge, which is undoubtedly the most well-known combat trial in French history. After Carouge accused Legris of abusing his wife, the courts did what any sane legal system would have done. They gave both men sharp swords and instructed them to let God handle the situation. King Charles VI himself attended the public, royally sanctioned duel, and from all accounts he was overly enthusiastic about it. The crowd numbered in the thousands. In the end, Carouges murdered Legris, which legally meant his wife was telling the truth, after horses were mounted, lances were broken, and armor was dented. That was the nature of truth in those days. The honest one was obviously the one who lived longest. The incident was so important that it sparked movies, publications, and a very unsettling amendment to French legislation in the immediate aftermath. When people understood that a stabbing judicial system would not be the most dependable, they subtly prohibited trial by battle. Then there is the 1467 duel between a Spanish knight and Burgundian champion Jacques Laleng, which involved hitting each other with sticks and was fought for prestige, diplomacy, and national pride. Hours of fighting ended in a draw, which is a polite way of indicating that everyone is too exhausted to continue acting like this is enjoyable. Not all duels were that spectacular. To decide who should be the choir director, one monk challenged another to a one-on-one fight. One of the nobles sneezed during the other's toast, which led to another feud. While these events did not change the course of history, they do remind us that medieval conflict resolution was only a sidelong glance away from bloodshed. While some duels molded noses, others shaped kingdoms, but they all followed the same reasoning. Put on some armor, pick up a stick, and hope your opponent didn't eat breakfast when words and evidence are insufficient. Words were a bit too important in the Middle Ages, particularly if they implied that someone's honor, lineage, or personal hygiene were lacking. Because medieval insults might very easily result in a legal fight and a shattered collarbone, but modern insults might result in a strongly worded email. In medieval society, insults were not only considered impolite, they were frequently punishable by law. It can be considered defamation to call someone a liar, a thief, or, Lord forbid, a coward. and the only appropriate answer? Let your sword better convey your feelings by challenging them to a duel. But saying you stink across a field wasn't the only way to offend someone. It had a particular flair, an elegance to it. In those days, it took 10 minutes to greet someone and 5 more to accuse your uncle of stealing sheep. The direct method was preferred by some. "You are a scoundrel and a knave, unworthy of your title and your trousers," is a traditional insult. Others took a more lyrical approach, calling opponents lower than the worms under the dung heap or the offspring of a flea-bitten sow. More syllables are preferable. Nobles engaged in verbal combat in a different way. Rather than shouting, they used intricate handwriting to write passive-aggressive letters, meticulously disparaging each other's bravery, style, or ancestry before waxing and shipping them on a horse, the most refined way to trash talk before a fight. Additionally, a formal challenge was issued, sometimes in writing and other times in front of witnesses, if the situation worsened, as it invariably did. A goblet may be knocked over, a glove flung. A gentleman even used a fish to hit his adversary, which seems absurd until you consider that it most likely still had teeth. It's interesting to note that occasionally the insult was harsher than the refusal to reply. Giving in made you appear weak, dishonorable, or, worst of all, uninteresting. Reputation was a major obsession in the medieval world. One well-chosen remark has the power to destroy a reputation, incite a duel, or ignite a family conflict that lasts for decades. With its beautiful words and very real repercussions, it was perilous land. You have insulted someone's heritage, spilt their ale, or gazed suspiciously admiringly at their sheep. With a sword you can hardly remember how to wield. You find yourself standing in a muddy field wondering how you got here. Now let's discuss strategy. First step, arrive. Although it may seem apparent throughout the Middle Ages, it was illegal to refuse to engage in combat. Depending on the sentencing patterns in your area, you can lose your left ear in addition to your honor and reputation. Attendance is therefore highly suggested unless you enjoy being publicly humiliated and/or losing your hearing. Step 2. Assess your opponent. Do they have the armor of a walking pantry? Are they perspiring through their visor already? Are they saying something that sounds like a final will and testament or praying tensely? Fantastic. Either you're going to become a legend or you're in trouble. Step 3. Be aware of your weapons. Aim for joints if you're using a longsword. Simply swing until you hear something break if it's maces. Congratulations if you both carry daggers. In front of everyone you've ever met, you're going to have a very embarrassing and personal wrestling match. Step 4. Apply psychology. It can be quite effective to shout random words. Before charging, one knight once cried, "Turnips." His opponent was flattened after he waited just long enough. Self-assurance is important. Being perplexing also help. Step 5. Avoid tripping. Not as easy as it seems. Panic, armor, and mud are all great conspirators. A spot in local history as a cautionary tale is assured when you fall flat on your face during the first 30 seconds of combat. Lastly, if you are going to lose, do it in a way that will be remembered. Make a dramatic noise. Swing stylishly. Make your last move so outrageous that it inspires ballads. Once a man shouted, "To the moon with you," and threw his sword. He didn't win because of it, but for weeks kids sung about it. Because you gain dignity when you win, but you gain immortality when you lose in style. Or a couple of inflated tales at the tavern anyway. Ultimately, dueling was about more than just winning. It was about performance, pride, and providing the audience with a topic of conversation. Not your funeral, please. You may have assumed by now that duels were all about honor, justice, and spectacular exits. However, more often than anyone wanted to acknowledge, duels were more about conveniently getting rid of someone while appearing to be honorable than they were about enforcing the law. Greetings from the shadowy side of dueling. Legalized murder is currently being wrapped in a ceremony. Imagine that you are a nobleman. There's a competitor. His falcon is obviously better trained and he is louder and richer. You cannot simply kill him. That is not civilized. Rather, you challenge him to a duel. You might offend his wife's needlework. Perhaps you accuse him of diluting his wine. Either you challenge him or he becomes enraged enough to challenge you. In any case, nobody is going to return from this, and everything is entirely lawful. Because this is the problem. Dueling was a state-approved method of murder in numerous locations and eras. You could beat a man to death in public and everyone would just nod gravely and say, "Ah, justice," as long as you followed the proper procedures, issued a challenge, had a witness, and mumbled something ambiguous about honor. When disagreeable persons needed to vanish with plausible deniability, this approach was particularly well liked. Competing claim to your property, duel. Is a political rival becoming too popular? Duel. That one baron who is always questioning the whereabouts of all the tax revenue? Certainly a duel. And if the duel was lost? Unfortunately, that's not good. You are plainly guilty since you are dead. If you prevailed, well done. The other guy's horse is likely yours to keep, and you're still alive and innocent. By employing professional fighters to represent them in battle, some duelists went one step further, essentially contracting out your honor to a person with stronger biceps. It would be even better if the hired muscle were to swiftly and dramatically execute the opponent. More cheers, less mess. Naturally, if the combat appeared official, everything worked better. You required the pre-fight prayers, the gowns, and the oaths. Everyone might then agree that it was a tragic but righteous ending when someone's head came off. It wasn't simply another bloody Tuesday, because murder was still prohibited throughout the Middle Ages, unless it was referred to as a duel. In the end, dueling lost its appeal, much like plague masks, leech-based treatment, and the notion that bathing was suspect. Duels started to disappear from public life by the late medieval era and the Renaissance, not because people were less violent, petty, or quickly offended, but rather because society began to provide somewhat less absurd means of resolving conflicts, such as courts and evidence, and the notion that perhaps we shouldn't use sharp instruments to beat each other in front of a priest in order to resolve disagreements. One major factor was the emergence of centralized regimes. The idea of private citizens using sword fights to settle disputes was not popular with kings, emperors, or whoever was shouting loudest in parliament. Too public, too dirty, and sometimes someone crucial gets lost. Everyone found that awkward. Additionally, the church ultimately implemented centuries of ambiguous criticism when legal institutions developed. They started enforcing trial by fight with real repercussions, such as excommunication, which was essentially God's blocking of a person in the Middle Ages. Additionally, there was the minor logistical issue: time, equipment, horses, armor, and a crowd prepared to wait for hours as two men bled slowly into a cabbage patch were all necessary for dueling. Not very effective, particularly as judges discovered they could just review documents, ask questions, and reach a decision without causing anyone any pain. Dueling had mostly become a gentleman's pastime by the 16th century. It is more stylish and less dirty. Swords were replaced with pistols. The rules got increasingly complex. At least you were wearing tights and had nice posture, even though it was still a good way to have yourself tragically killed. Even that eventually outlived its usefulness. There were laws passed. The public's attitude changed. Additionally, duels evolved from a respected judicial proceeding to an odd college activity your uncle engaged in. Trial by battle is largely limited to historical reenactments, odd legal arguments, and that one guy on the internet who claims it's still allowed in Idaho. As a result, the medieval duel ended its existence. Loudly, theatrically, and a little perplexed as to what it was meant to achieve. The peasant healer was the first and frequently only line of defense against illness in the medieval countryside, where doctors were scarce and hospitals were even scarcer. These healers had strong links to their communities and were mostly women. Despite lacking official training, they acquired their expertise through oral transmission, tradition, and observation that was passed down through the centuries. They used the natural world to manufacture their cures, minerals, flowers, roots, and plants that can be found in the fields and forests that encircle the settlement. A healer's practice frequently took place at her house. Herb bundles hung from the rafters within, drying in the hearth's smoke. Jars of oils, animal fats, beeswax, and broken bark dotted the shelves. Long before anyone realized that willow bark contains salicin, the forerunner to modern aspirin, she may boil it to relieve pain or make a compress with comfrey to minimize swelling. Although experimental, the treatments were informed by centuries of inherited knowledge. Belief and spirituality were integral to the healing process. It was not always believed that illness was solely a bodily state. It might be the consequence of evil spirits, a curse, or sin. In addition to their treatments, healers would say prayers or blessings. Some employed ritual motions, charms, or incantations to safeguard both the body and the soul. In this way, healing was holistic, addressing the patient's bodily discomfort and spiritual instability at the same time. Peasant healers were valuable, but they had to tread carefully. Although their expertise was valued and sought after, it might also raise suspicions. The community's thankfulness might easily give way to anxiety during bad circumstances, like a failed harvest or an unexpected death. If a woman's herbal treatments didn't work, or if her behavior was seen as strange or evasive, she could be accused of witchcraft. However, the healer was essential to the typical peasant. She calmed fevers, healed broken bones, gave birth, and consoled the dying. In a world when there were few choices, her presence provided hope. Her treatments might not have always been effective by today's standards, but they were a combination of faith, scientific observation, and a profound knowledge of nature. The peasant healer was a representation of fortitude and compassion during a time of uncertainty. Illness was more than simply deteriorating health in the highly religious and frequently superstitious world of medieval peasants. It might have been an indication of a spiritual assault or malevolent influence. The invention of witch bottles, tiny vessels loaded with protective objects intended to trap or repel bad magic, was one of the most odd and popular strategies for protecting against these invisible forces. Although clay vessels were ubiquitous in rural regions, these bottles were usually made of glass or stoneware. Many symbolic objects, iron nails, the victim's hair or nail clippings, red threads, pins, herbs, and even urine were placed within by the healer or occasionally the sick individual. The urine was said to draw the witch who caused the ailment's attention, and once she was drawn in, the rusty or sharp contents of the bottle would injure or imprison her spirit, leaving her helpless. Once prepared, the witch bottle would be placed upside down under the threshold, under the fire, or next to a home's entry. The key was placement. Dark forces had to be stopped before they could infiltrate the dwelling. Another bottle might be created if the illness continued or got worse, or the original might be unearthed, changed, and reburied with more potent chemicals. These items weren't uncommon. Archaeologists have discovered hundreds of them, frequently remaining sealed, with their contents unaltered for centuries throughout medieval Europe, particularly in England and Germany. Their existence is a silent monument to the anxieties that plagued common people, the fear that illness was caused by curses, jealousy, or invisible spiritual warfare in addition to cold weather or contaminated water. To fend off evil, peasants occasionally concealed apotropaic marks, symbols etched into walls, doors, or lintels, in addition to witch bottles. These could be pentagrams, circles, or the intertwined letters VV, which stand for the Virgin Mary's protection. These placards weren't just ornaments. They served as silent protectors, shielding families from disease and bad luck. These customs may appear odd now, but they are a reflection of a worldview in which belief was closely linked to both health and illness. To the medieval farmer, physical protection entailed spiritual protection, which meant avoiding any risks with invisible forces. Nature was more than just the setting for everyday life for medieval peasants. It was the silent instructor, the pharmacy, and the library of the healer. Those who farmed the land relied on years of collected knowledge about which plants were beneficial and which were harmful when sickness struck. Herbs were among the most reliable allies during a period when official medicine was unavailable and frequently misinterpreted. Villages were surrounded by forests and meadows that were abundant in medicinal plants. Because it was thought to halt bleeding and encourage healing, yarrow was collected for wounds, chamomile aided with sleep and calmed irritable tummies, mugwort was used in poultices for sore joints or burned to prevent disease. Despite its sting, nettle was used to make teas that helped with joint discomfort, boosted urine, and cleansed the body of what were referred to as evil humours. Whether it was before the solstice, after the morning dew, or during the correct moon phase, peasant healers knew when to pick each plant. Time was of the essence. It was thought that the season, the stars, and the custom of gathering a plant all affected its effectiveness. It was a religious practice, not just science. Rituals or prayers were frequently mixed with herbs. A healer may bless the water used in a herbal infusion or utter a charm while crushing the leaves. The remedy's preparation was nearly as significant as the components. The idea that illness had both a physical and a spiritual source was represented in this blending of natural and spiritual treatment. Knowledge was transmitted verbally in the absence of written books. A healer may educate her apprentice, daughter, or a trusted neighbor how to distinguish between safe and harmful mushrooms, or which roots are best dried and which should be cooked. Recipes were not written down, they were memorized. Some families kept their proprietary blends under wraps for many generations. Peasant societies acquired an instinctive knowledge of the body and how nature may benefit it despite their lack of access to modern chemistry or microscopes. Many of the remedies were remarkably effective, even though not all of them were able to cure. Several of the herbs they utilized have antibacterial and anti-inflammatory qualities that have been verified by modern science. Herbalism was not just a talent, it was a silent, unrelenting way to live and be independent. A bundle of dried plants could be the difference between hope and despair in the midst of plagues and bad harvests. Herbs and prayer were not the only treatments used by medieval peasants. Numerous therapies were based on an older, more profound custom that maintained that animals had unique qualities that might ward off illness, break curses, or bring the body back into equilibrium. Frog poultices and toad-based remedies, which were once widely used in rural Europe, were among the most peculiar of them. The reasoning was both physical and symbolic. It is possible to press a live frog against an infected wound or sore throat before releasing it into a stream. It was thought that the disease would be absorbed by the frog and carried away by the stream. Frogs were cut open and placed directly on the body in more severe cases. It was believed that the disease would leave its human host when it was transferred into the animal, frequently with the help of a spoken charm. Made from crushed and dried toads, toad powder was occasionally applied to wounds or used in salves. This may sound gloomy, but it originated from the idea that repels. If the disease was brought on by something poisonous or alien, it could only be fought off by a creature with similar magical abilities. Snakes, mice, and even spiders were used in folk medicine, in addition to frogs and toads. For instance, modern science now recognizes that spider webs, which contain vitamin K in their silk, are somewhat helpful at promoting clotting and binding wounds. Children with chronic coughs were given mice boiled in milk. As talismans against fever, snakeskins were worn around the neck. These were not arbitrary treatments. They were ingrained in a mindset that viewed illness as something external, something that might be ejected, passed on, or prevented with symbolic substitutes. Even the most unconventional therapy was worthwhile during a period when illnesses could spread quickly and there were few available treatments. It was also thought that animals may provide information about a person's health. It was an indication that death might be approaching if a cat avoided a child's bed or if a dog refused to lie close to someone. A bird tapping at the window, on the other hand, might indicate healing or, in certain situations, divine warning. Peasants relied on the indications provided by nature when there was no other option. Their culture was full of silent customs, tiny gestures, and the unwavering belief that a cure might be concealed inside a frog's body. The sky was more than just a source of weather and illumination in medieval peasant life. It was a driving force that affected everything, from disease treatment to crop sowing. It was believed that the moon, stars, and shifting sky all influenced the rise and fall of health. Understanding the sky was a prerequisite for healing the body. Specifically, the moon was regarded as a potent force in the body's equilibrium. Applying a medicine at the wrong period in the lunar cycle or bleeding a patient, according to many healers, could cause more harm than benefit. The waxing or waning of the moon was carefully considered when scheduling treatments. Taking medications to boost vitality was best done during a waxing moon, which was increasing toward fullness and was linked to strength and regeneration. Conversely, a declining moon was associated with purification and was thought to be ideal for eliminating evil humor or disease. This heavenly reasoning also applied to births, surgeries, and even nail or hair trimmings. When the moon was in the incorrect sign, doing these activities was believed to bring bad luck or delayed healing. Like the earth, the body was viewed as a vessel that was in sync with the rhythms of nature, and the moon served as its clock. Astrology has a slight but enduring influence outside of the moon. Peasants were frequently knowledgeable of basic star signs and planetary influences, even though complete horoscopic readings were more the purview of the educated elite. To ascertain when Venus, which is linked to moisture and fertility, could favor healing, or when Mars, which is frequently avoided for bloodletting due to its fiery and violent nature, was ascendant, a healer could reference an almanac or rely on local legislation. A common depiction in medieval calendars and manuscripts, the zodiac man, indicated which bodily parts were governed by which sign of the zodiac. The head was ruled by Aries, the neck by Taurus, and so forth. This number could be used by healers to determine when and where to treat a patient, or whether to hold off until more favorable circumstances arise. For the medieval peasant, these concepts brought order in an unpredictable environment, even though they may seem far-fetched now. The sky was more than a far-off ornament. It served as a living map of unseen forces providing direction, hope, and structure. Observing the sky was a way to find solace not only from the natural world, but also from the universe's own rhythm. Medieval peasants frequently looked to the divine in a world where illness may strike at any time and treatment was unpredictable. For many, the saints' blessings were the source of healing rather than medicines or stars. It was thought that their clothing, bones, or even a fragment of their coffin had magical properties. When all earthly cures had failed, these holy objects, or relics, were the focal point of spiritual healing. Churches, monasteries, and occasionally even the private residences of the nobles housed relics. To visit shrines rumored to contain the relics of saints with healing powers, pilgrims traveled great distances. They wanted a portion of St. Catherine's finger, the blood of St. Thomas Becket, and the incorrupt body of St. Cuthbert. It was thought that the faithful may be healed just by touching these relics or even by being in their presence. Peasants were occasionally given access to more commonplace relics in local parishes, like a strip of cloth that had touched a shrine or a drop of oil from a saint's lamp. These relics were either used by priests to bless the sick or placed on the affected part of the body while praying. The conviction was in the spiritual force that the thing carried through divine association, not in the object itself. In the hopes of healing, peasants would frequently offer sacrifices, pray novenas, or burn candles to particular saints. Saint Roch was called for wounds and disease, Saint Sebastian for plague, and Saint Apollonia for toothaches. These relationships weren't arbitrary. Both the saint's life and the miracles they were thought to have worked after they passed away were reflected in them. Local ceremonies occasionally mimicked the power of relics for people who were too sick or impoverished to travel. A healer might bind a charm around a limb that has the name of a saint written on paper. Even calling up the saint's name in a hushed prayer could be consoling if there was no relic available. The devotion of relics gave peasants access to something as potent, faith, while science was still centuries away from offering definitive answers for illness. Believing that a higher power was concerned about the suffering in a harsh world gave people fortitude and, in some cases, healing, according to many. Words had power in medieval peasant life, not only in church rites and prayers, but also in the muttered charms and quietly spoken incantations meant to ward off illness and bad luck. Healing was as much about prevention as it was about treatment, and for many, a charm worn around the neck or a silent saying passed down from mother to kid was the first offense rather than medication. Charms could be in many different forms. Some were written words that were etched on wood or parchment in Latin or the regional dialect. They were then folded and worn in a tiny pouch near the body. Others were uttered out loud and repeated a predetermined number of times, usually 3 or 7, which are considered sacred numbers in both Christian and folklore. Depending on local customs and the healer's background, the sentences may invoke nature spirits, saints, angels, or God. Physical items known as talismans were thought to have protective properties. They might be as basic as a coin blessed at a temple, a stone with a natural hole, or a wolf's tooth. It was a common idea that carrying a lightning-stricken object would shield you from spiritual harm or illness brought on by bad air. Iron was also believed to ward off evil energies. Tiny iron knives put under pillows or nails hammered into entrances were employed to prevent illness. Newborns and children were frequently provided additional protection. They could have a wax figurine of a saint, a chain with blessed beads, or a piece of St. John's wort stitched into their clothes or draped over their cradle. Children's illnesses were frequently attributed to the evil eye or malevolent spirits, and charms were thought to be necessary to ward against these forces. Some charms were private. Some were extremely personal, passed down via generations and never discussed out loud with outsiders. It was thought that revealing the words would weaken their impact. In many areas, the healer's reputation depended as much on her herbal knowledge as it did on her hidden charms. Even though we could now consider such items to be superstitious, they symbolized a deep faith in the unseen network of forces that pervaded everyday existence. For the medieval peasant, healing was a lifetime endeavor to protect the body and soul using all available resources, not merely a reaction to disease. The rhythm of the village year offered chances for seasonal cures and group rites, but the majority of medieval healing occurred in houses or through individual remedies. The distinction between tradition, religion, and medicine became hazy as a result of these incidents. They were times when the whole community came together to seek protection, rejuvenation, and spiritual and physical healing. It was believed that the body and spirit were particularly susceptible with the change of the seasons. It was thought that certain transitions, such as the spring equinox, harvest, or midwinter, weakened the body's natural defenses, leaving people more vulnerable to disease. Villagers would engage in ceremonies intended to purify the body or fend off evil energies over the upcoming months in order to combat this. During seasonal festivals, burning herbs, especially mugwort, juniper, and wormwood, was a traditional practice. It was thought that the smoke protected residents from illness and cleansed homes. Families would wave the smoke over cattle, walk through it, or even pass their kids through it. This was a sincerely held conviction in the protective nature of nature, not just a symbolic one. On specific feast days, people in various areas would visit holy wells or sacred springs. Believed to be touched by supernatural power or blessed by saints, people would bathe or drink in the waters. Prayers were whispered, as stones were positioned close to the water's edge as offerings, or clutis, or pieces of cloth, were attached to trees nearby. In equal measure, these were gestures of healing and dedication. Special masses and blessings were held on the feast days of healing saints, such as Saint Hildegard, who was linked to health and herbal knowledge, or Saint Blaise, who was known for protecting throats. During these times, sick community members may be anointed with oil or given holy water. Some communities had a custom known as beating the bounds, where whole families would round the parish lines while reciting prayers to preserve their land from illness and bad luck. These collective deeds strengthened social cohesiveness and spiritual protection. When illness was a continual concern, recovery was something to be shared, honored, and protected collectively, rather than being solely an individual endeavor. These customs served as a potent reminder that, like faith, health was something that was best fostered in community in a society where survival frequently rested on the strength of the village. Healing was never only a matter of survival in the world of medieval peasants. It also involved a careful balancing act between what the church approved of and what may be deemed heretical. Even though peasants relied heavily on charms, herbs, relics, and prayers, they also lived in constant fear of being accused of witchcraft if they deviated too much from the norm. This was a legitimate fear. Many village healers, especially women, were torn between distrust and adoration. If a woman could treat fevers or make childbirth easier, she might be hailed one year and condemned the next. Whispers could become into charges if a recuperation didn't work, or if a neighbor's cow passed away shortly after a remedy was administered. There had to be a reason for misfortune, and when it did, the healer's strength was an easy target. While they imposed clear boundaries, church authorities allowed many ancient activities, particularly those that invoked saints or were enveloped in Christian iconography. The employment of hidden words or symbols, astrology, and invocations to unidentified spirits were all seen with growing skepticism. Any form of healing that did not specifically depend on divine intervention ran the risk of being classified as a cult. The distinction between prohibited magic and folk medicine was ill-defined and frequently changed depending on the political climate of the day. In the later Middle Ages, witch trials did take place, albeit they were not yet at their height. Occasionally, healers were charged with forming alliances with evil forces or using their expertise to curse rather than heal. Others faced interrogation, public censure, or worse. Others just fell silent, opting out of fear to stop sharing their solutions. Nevertheless, folk healing persisted in spite of these risks. Communities continued to bury witch bottles under their doorsteps, tie ribbons at holy springs, and consult their local herbalists and wise women. Fear and faith lived together. Despite the church's warnings against superstition, people clung to what little hope they had when they heard a kid with a fever or saw sickness spreading among a field of workers. Medieval peasants bravely negotiated the riddle of illness in this precarious equilibrium between heaven and earth, between conventional wisdom and forbidden knowledge. The body was never the only aspect of healing. It was about surviving, believing, and trusting in a world where everything was fashioned by the invisible. One of the most eerie representations of pre-modern medicine is still the plague doctor mask. Its waxed robe, dark, wide eyes, and long beak have made it a visual shorthand for the mystery and fear of the Black Death. These days, it's frequently utilized in gloomy art, costumes, and horror movies. However, the mask's original purpose was not to frighten. Instead, it was a last-ditch effort at spiritual and physical defense in a world that didn't fully comprehend the concept of contagion. Although the Black Death itself had decimated Europe centuries earlier in the 14th century, the mask did not appear until the 17th century. Physicians had started to formulate more organized theories regarding the spread of disease by the time the beaked mask was used, but many of these concepts were still seriously erroneous. The idea of miasma, which held that diseases were transmitted by noxious, odorous, and imperceptible vapors that might enter the body through the mouth and nose, was foremost among them. In order to combat this, physicians treating plague donned masks that contained aromatic compounds. The beak was a practical rather than a decorative choice. It made room for a tiny room to store dried flowers, spices, herbs, and occasionally even linen soaked in vinegar. Lavender, mint, camphor, cloves, and anything else thought to cleanse the air or repel the invisible poison were common elements. Glass lenses were frequently used in the eyes, and they were sealed to keep contaminated air out of the eyes. The doctor was able to examine patients without coming into close contact with them, because to the remainder of the gear, which was similarly purposeful and included a long waxed coat, gloves, boots, and a staff. The mask frequently signaled impending death to those who saw it. These medical professionals visited patients, placed residences under quarantine, and kept track of fatalities. Although they did not perform miracles, their presence served as a sobering reminder that people still ventured to visit the homes of those who were suffering. The plague doctor's mask was a creation of fear, hope, and the boundaries of current knowledge rather than a theatrical costume. It was a mask designed for survival rather than vanity, and it symbolized the best early medicine could do to confront an adversary it could not understand. It wasn't until centuries after the Black Death first ravaged Europe in the 14th century that the image of the plague doctor emerged, dressed in black, with a staff and a beaked mask. The first references to such uniformed physicians occurred during subsequent outbreaks, particularly in France and Italy in the 17th century. Official plague doctors, who are paid by municipalities to treat the afflicted, record the dead, and supervise public health initiatives, had already started to be appointed by cities by this point. These men weren't necessarily the best or most experienced medical professionals. Many were actually young, ill-trained, or foreign practitioners who were prepared to perform the lethal tasks that others shunned. Although the profession was dangerous and frequently unappreciated, it occasionally provided stable income or opportunities for career progression. In less developed cities and isolated areas, even a small medical presence was preferable than none at all. Charles Delorme, a personal physician to numerous French royals, standardized the plague doctor costume in 1619. He created it to shield the user from miasma, the supposedly noxious air thought to be disease-carrying. The ensemble consisted of a wide-brimmed hat, leggings, boots, leather gloves, and a full-length waxed coat. It was completed with a cane for remote patient examination and the now famous beaked mask. The plague doctor's job was a terrible one. They were required to enter homes under quarantine, examine the ill and dying, give simple treatments, and maintain thorough records of infections and fatalities. To make sure no one left infectious areas without authorization, they also assisted in enforcing quarantine regulations or conducting autopsy in some places. Many plague doctors, in spite of their official credentials, were not very effective in curing the illness. Bloodletting, herbal tinctures, vinegar washes, and purging were the most basic forms of treatment. Instead of recovery, the majority focused on documentation and prevention. Nevertheless, their presence was an attempt, if a little one, to address a frightening and enigmatic menace. The black-clad doctor became a recognizable and eerily unnerving presence as the epidemic began to wreak havoc on communities. The appearance of a plague doctor was seen by people who watched from their windows as evidence that disease had already spread. It served as a living reminder of society's susceptibility and will to fight back. The plague doctor's mask was based on the idea that purification and fragrance may provide protection. It was not a decorative long beak. It was intended to make room for aromatic compounds which were believed to purify the air before it entered the lungs. Disease was thought to spread by miasma, or unclean air, in an era before microscopes and bacterial knowledge. The beaked mask was the most famous use of this notion, which influenced a lot of medical thought throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern era. Usually a mixture of dried flowers, herbs and resins were found in the beak. Lavender, rose petals, mint, cloves, myrrh, cinnamon and camphor were among the most often used substances. Not all of these were picked at random. Many were linked to sanctity, cleanliness, or powerful attractive scents that could mask offensive odors. Others, such as juniper berries or sponges soaked in vinegar, were thought to have antiseptic qualities, although this knowledge was based only on observation and lacked scientific support. The mask's curving beak, which served as a crude air filter, was crammed full of these components. Every day, some doctors made changes to the contents. Others modified them based on the severity of the local outbreak or the symptoms they experienced. The doctor was supposed to prevent infection by inhaling filtered air. However, the truth was more nuanced. Although it's simple to write off this behavior as being erroneous, it's crucial to understand its rationale in light of the historical backdrop. Despite its flaws, the miasma theory was founded on reliable observation. Disease and decay were frequently accompanied by foul odors. Where the stink was greatest, death followed in many communities. Thus, the mask served as a barrier against a fearsome and unseen foe, as well as a medical instrument and a type of psychological armor. These herbal concoctions might have offered some slight respite in certain situations. Clove and thyme are two examples of herbs that do have antibacterial qualities. Others might have covered up the overpowering smell of death or helped calm the doctor's anxiety. However, the beak never really prevented infection. In the face of so much uncertainty, it was an act of hope. The beaked mask is still regarded as one of the first pieces of protective equipment in medical history, despite its drawbacks. It signaled a slight shift in belief that disease might be prevented, confined, or managed by human action. Although the most recognizable aspect of the plague doctor's clothing is the beaked mask, it was only one piece of a meticulously crafted outfit that was intended to shield the doctor from exposure. Based on the prevalent notions of disease transmission, particularly the idea that disease may spread by touch and contaminated air, each component, from the cap to the boots, had a distinct function. In order to keep bodily fluids out, plague doctors wore long, waxed cloaks made of leather or heavy canvas that were frequently covered in animal fat or wax. In order to keep the skin from becoming contaminated, the cloak, which wrapped the body from neck to ankle, was occasionally sealed at the sleeves. Several layers of fabric underneath served as an additional barrier and source of insulation. Tall leather boots protected the legs and feet from polluted surfaces, and thick gloves protected the hands. A broad-brimmed hat, usually composed of leather or rigid cloth, covered the head. In addition to completing the ensemble, this hat helped to set plague doctors apart from the general public, a crucial function at a period of chaos and terror. The hat granted entry to patient homes and isolated areas by identifying the wearer as a medical authority. The staff was arguably the most neglected aspect of the uniform. The staff, which was often several feet long and made of wood, permitted the doctor to keep a physical distance. It was used to lift patients' garments, inspect wounds, look for life, or even give directions to people around them. In certain instances, it acted as a sign of authority, assisting medical professionals in enforcing quarantine regulations or navigating crowded areas. When worn together, the entire costume formed a physical wall separating the doctor from the outside world. The uniform did provide some psychological comfort to physicians and the populations they served, even though its ability to stop the spread of disease was limited because the true culprits, bacteria and fleas, were unknown. The uniform created a sense of control in the face of an unseen threat by establishing order and protocol at a period of widespread terror. It was also a watershed in the history of medicine. Centuries before the germ hypothesis of disease would ultimately change the rules of medicine, personal protective equipment was invented. The truth of plague doctors' medical procedures was significantly less clear, despite the fact that they were frequently depicted as knowledgeable and powerful individuals. Treatments relied on humoral theory, miasma, and long-standing medicinal customs carried over from classical antiquity because neither germs nor viruses were understood. Because of this, a large portion of the treatments that plague doctors recommended were experimental, symbolic, or based more on hope than on science. The four humours theory, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was the most widely accepted medical explanation for disease at the time. Many treatments aimed to restore homeostasis, since it was thought that disease developed when these fluids were out of balance. As a result, bloodletting, either by applying leeches or by cutting veins, became widely used. Additionally, patients received laxatives to clear their systems or emetics to make them throw up. The use of herbal treatments was important. Because they were thought to have strengthening or purifying qualities, doctors and healers used plants including garlic, sage, rosemary, and angelica. These herbs were applied directly to swellings or taken orally as infusions, poultices, or powders. In order to purify the air, some patients were told to burn herbs in their houses, while others were told to drink vinegar and rose water. Buboes, or infected swellings, were occasionally lanced and drained, but this practice frequently resulted in secondary infections. Placing a toad or pigeon on top of the buboes was another popular technique, with the idea being that the animal would attract the poison. In severe situations, a painful and frantic attempt to cauterize the illness involved applying hot irons to the wounds. Treatments differed by patient status in addition to geography. While the impoverished were frequently left with simple interventions or prayer, wealthier people might receive more attention and a greater variety of therapies. Once the plague had spread, recovery was uncommon despite these attempts. Many of the therapies may have even accelerated death, and the majority provided little to no genuine benefit. Nonetheless, an early attempt at a coordinated public health response was made by the work of plague physicians. In the midst of enormous loss, their presence provided order to chaos and reflected the imperfect but enduring belief that something might be done. The main objective of authorities as the plague ravaged towns and cities was not just to care for the ill, but also to stop the disease from spreading. Quarantine was at the core of the early public health initiatives that resulted from this. The term itself is derived from the Italian quarantagione, which means 40 days, and refers to the amount of time ships had to stay moored outside ports before people and goods could enter. Quarantine regulations were frequently enforced directly by plague doctors. They examined the ill, located infected homes, and issued orders to seal off structures. No one was permitted to leave a marked house, which might be indicated by a warning attached to the door or by a painted red cross. If at all, food and supplies would be transported through windows. These homes turned into islands in their own neighborhoods, shrouded in terror and quiet. Travel between regions was severely restricted, city gates were sealed, and entire neighborhoods might be blocked off. One of the first lazaretto's official quarantine stations was set up on an island in the lagoon in Venice. To await recovery or death, those exhibiting symptoms or merely suspected of exposure were sent there. In order to keep an eye on patients and record fatalities, plague doctors were occasionally stationed in lazarettos themselves. Even though they didn't fully grasp the etiology of the sickness, their records became crucial for both tracking its spread and identifying its patterns. Many physicians became ill. Even while their protective gear could have provided some physical barrier, fleas and bacteria that were not yet known to science were far more dangerous than the actual disease-causing organisms. Despite their severity, these actions were not ineffective. Even unintentionally, minimizing contact between the ill and the healthy served to reduce the spread of infection. But there was a huge psychological cost. Communities were engulfed in desperation, distrust, and isolation. In dread, many turned against their neighbors, left loved ones behind, or fled cities. The harsh reality of a world without remedies was represented in quarantine. It was a tactic developed out of necessity rather than expertise. Within its boundaries, the plague doctor came to represent both assistance and the fact that survival frequently required sacrifice and separation. The image of the plague doctor occupied an odd and frequently uneasy place in the public consciousness of the era. They combined elements of an omen, an official, and a healer. They were immediately identifiable due to their shrouded, veiled, and quiet look, but it was also quite unnerving. The presence of a plague doctor in their neighborhood did not inspire optimism in many. It was an indication that death had already arrived. The medieval worldview was rife with symbolism, superstition, and religious conviction. Many people believed that illness was a result of sin or a punishment from God. With its swift and indiscriminate destruction, the epidemic appeared to corroborate this theory. The plague doctor's strange attire and equipment assumed an almost supernatural character in this setting. Some people thought the masks had magical qualities of their own. Others were concerned that rather than curing disease, plague doctors might spread it. There were many rumors. Some whispered that rather than collecting patients, plague doctors collected souls. Others thought they were immune to the disease because of dark pacts or secret information, or because they practiced forbidden techniques. The terror and mystery surrounding the sick were only heightened by the fact that doctors rarely went into homes without full clothing and frequently avoided speaking to them directly. Nevertheless, communities continued to turn to them in times of need. It was feared that a plague doctor would arrive, but it was terrible that they would not. They were the sole organized reaction to an otherwise unseen and terrifying threat, despite their peculiar clothing and restricted techniques. A visit by a plague doctor suggested that you had not been completely deserted. Later centuries' literature and art would further establish the plague doctor's reputation as a Gothic horror figure. Long after it was no longer in use, the beak mask came to represent death and fear. Its image is still present in popular culture, horror literature, and festivals today, but it is portrayed as a symbol of fear rather than medical assistance. The era's hazy boundaries between science, superstition, and faith were mirrored in this dichotomy of healer and omen. People perceived plague doctors as straddling the boundaries between medicine and magic, protection and prophecy. Despite forces they could not completely see or comprehend, they were both witnesses to disaster and representations of a frail human response. The plague doctor's reputation has become legendary in modern times. Its black cloak, large curved beak, and blank glass eyes make it readily recognizable. However, this potent symbol, so frequently linked to the Middle Ages, is frequently misinterpreted and misplaced in history. The famous plague doctor mask was not created during the first major wave of the Black Death in the 14th century, unlike what many people think. It wasn't until the 17th century that the most recognizable version of the costume, the beaked mask and waxed overcoat, became popular, especially in France and Italy during subsequent outbreaks. In the past, doctors who treated patients with the Black Death wore no such attire. Some actually worked with no safety equipment at all, which added to their high death rates. In addition to medical, art and comedy also contributed to the development of the modern image of the plague doctor. illustrators started to exaggerately portray plague doctors in the 17th and 18th centuries, pose that emphasized their otherworldly presence, eyes that were enlarged for impact, and beaks that were longer than necessary. The distinction between theatrical portrayal and medical documentation was muddled by these pictures. Over time, the artwork lost its connection to its original setting. By the 19th and 20th centuries, plague doctors were more closely linked to dark symbolism, masquerade costumes, and folk terror than to real medical history. The beaked mask became a figure of spectacle and performance when it was incorporated into the customs of the Venetian carnival. After losing its original purpose, the eerie mask evolved into a persona that was a combination of a healer and a ghost. These days, the plague doctor may be found in anything from historical dramas and Halloween costumes to video games and graphic novels. Not only is it unusual, but it also symbolizes a period of anxiety, bewilderment, and the human tendency to defend against the unknown, which is why it is so popular. The tale behind the mask, however, is one of early attempts to prevent sickness, of lives lost in service, and of the tenuous link between modern science and medieval superstition. The plague doctor's legacy is not limited to their attire. It also encompasses the environment they encountered, which was devoid of explanations, and their bravery in venturing into it. The plague doctor is still a representation of human tenacity, which is far more resilient than fear, despite the frightening mask and historical myths. These people entered the center of the worst outbreaks in history with purpose rather than certainty, during a time when science was restricted and answers were few. Even though their equipment and knowledge were imperfect, their presence demonstrated a deliberate decision to face danger for the benefit of others. Whether they were volunteers or medical professionals, plague doctors frequently operated alone. In an era before contemporary medical facilities, they went into infected homes, traversed streets bare of dead people, and recorded the number of people affected by epidemics. They noted the names of the deceased, noted symptoms, and in certain instances, even carried out preliminary epidemiological research, documenting mortality rates and patterns of transmission. They established the foundation for future public health procedures, even though they were unable to stop the sickness. Their practices, quarantines, protective gear, and herbal fumigation reflect a civilization that is starting to realize that despite the fact that disease cannot yet be treated, it can be contained. In this sense, the plague doctor served as a bridge, with one foot in the new field of observation, statistics, and organized response, and the other in the world of humor, saints, and superstition. Their uniform, which appears so odd to modern eyes, was the product of a rational system constructed using the resources and ideologies of the day. The beaked masks and waxed cloaks were not signs of ignorance, but rather of adaptability, early, flawed models of the personal protective equipment that would be crucial centuries later. Maybe that's why the picture still sticks around. The plague doctor serves as a reminder of both the dread of pandemics and the human resistance to them. People appeared even in an era dominated by mystery and death. Despite the dangers and the chances, they attempted, documented, persevered, and experimented. Born from one of Europe's most powerful houses, Isabella of France came into the world in 1295. She was the daughter of Queen Joan of Navarre and King Philip IV of France. Her father was a king renowned for his icy efficiency and rigorous rule over his domain. His pale complexion and harsh, symmetrical features earned him the epithet Philip the Fair, not for his generosity. Courtly formality, dynastic expectations, and the delicate art of diplomacy all influenced Isabella's early years. Isabella was raised in the Capetian court and was given a royally appropriate education. She received instruction in statecraft in addition to languages, religion, and manners. She discovered early on that she would not have her own life. It would be a piece on a much bigger political chessboard, an instrument of alliance. It was an early opportunity. Isabella was engaged to Edward II of England, the Plantagenet heir, when she was 12 years old. This union was hardly a love affair. After years of competing claims and territorial conflicts, it was a calculated maneuver to ease tensions between France and England. Peace was intended to be ensured by the marriage, which was sealed in 1302. Rather, it would ultimately spark one of the most dramatic periods in the history of the English monarchy. In 1308, Isabella crossed the Channel from France to wed Edward. She arrived at the English court, still a young girl, with dignity and poise, but she soon discovered that the atmosphere was unfriendly. Her father had not anticipated Edward II as a monarch. He lacked political expertise, was emotionally aloof, and was totally loyal to Piers Gaveston, his masculine favourite. Despite her youth, Isabella recognized right away that she had been rejected. Isabella was the obedient queen in the early years of her marriage. She carried out her ceremonial responsibilities and gave birth to children, including the future Edward III. On the inside, though, she was waiting, learning, and observing. She would eventually challenge the English crown itself because of her political insight, cleverness, and devotion to her French heritage. Quiet obedience was not Isabella's narrative. It was immediately apparent that this queen was destined to dominate rather than be ruled. Isabella's role as queen was more symbolic than significant in the early years of her reign. Isabella was mostly ignored at court despite having royal ancestry and being married to the King of England. Edward II, her spouse, publicly declared his love for the charming and aspirational aristocrat Piers Gaveston. Despite never having a formal definition, their connection was obviously more than just political. Gaveston was showered with titles and presents by Edward, often at Isabella's cost. Isabella was humiliated by this public favoritism. At formal occasions, Gaveston was given precedence over the Queen, and her own home needs were occasionally overlooked as her husband provided the money for his companion's excesses. Many members of the English nobility found this behavior to be hazardous, in addition to disrespectful. They saw Isabella's increasing seclusion as a possible risk, and Gaveston as a corrupting force on the monarch. Isabella did not, however, act hastily. She watched. She waited. She was still a teenager, but she knew the importance of patience and court politics. She had silent power because of her royal ancestry. Across the Channel, her father Philip IV continued to hold sway. In 1308, Edward was finally driven to banish Gaveston by English lords, in part because of Isabella's damaged dignity. However, Edward quickly brought Gaveston back, which led to more hostilities. When a gang of nobles arrested and executed Gaveston without the king's consent in 1312, the tension peaked. While Edward grieved for his friend, Isabella's standing started to rise. Isabella emerged from the crisis as a more prominent personality, and the court had learnt that unbridled royal favoritism may split the kingdom. But Edward made the same mistakes over the course of the following 10 years. His new favourites after Gaveston's passing were the Despencer family, especially Hugh Despencer, the younger. The cycle of political instability, animosity, and favouritism returned. Pushing aside once more, Isabella saw the realm descend into war, but this time she would not keep quiet. Isabella had seen her husband's frailties and the betrayals of the court. She was no longer the reserved French girl. She was a mother, a queen, and a strategist who was starting to realize how much of an impact she had on Europe as a whole, not just in England. What had started out as exclusion was on the verge of becoming revolution. Isabella's marriage had turned into a battlefield by 1325. Her relationship with Edward II had long soured, and the realm was on the verge of rebellion because to his unwavering allegiance to Hugh Despencer the younger. As power brokers who enriched themselves while punishing the king's opponents, the Despensers were more than just royal favourites. Entire families lived in fear of Despencer vengeance, nobles were disinherited, and executions were carried out. Isabella had lost her estates and power, just like many others. Under the guise of a diplomatic journey, Isabella made the pivotal decision to leave England for France. Following the deaths of their elder siblings, her brother, Charles IV, now occupied the French throne. Isabella was entrusted with mending the rift between Charles and Edward, who were at odds over land in Gascony. But after she got there, she wouldn't go back. Self-exile and a deliberate step toward resistance replaced what had started as a royal errand. Isabella made a daring and unheard-of move. She refused to go back to England as long as Hugh Despenser was in charge. Citing the oppression of the Despensers and her husband's lack of concern, she said she was afraid for her life. Her refusal was both a controversy and a brilliant move. A queen consort was publicly opposing a reigning monarch for the first time, and she was winning allies in the process. Isabella formed a strong friendship with Roger Mortimer, an English aristocrat who had escaped Edward's fury while she was in France. Their relationship quickly evolved from a political one to a personal one. It's unknown if they had already started dating, but by the time they teamed up, their passions were irreconcilable. Together, they started enlisting the help of disgruntled French allies and English aristocrats. The heir apparent to the English throne, Edward of Windsor, was another of Isabella's aces. She demanded that he leave his father's influence and follow her to France. She had legitimacy because of the boy. She was more than just an irate monarch. She acted to shield the crown from despotism and was the mother of the future king. Isabella started constructing a revolution from exile. She wasn't only avoiding Despenser anymore, she was getting ready to overthrow a monarch. Isabella of France had changed from an exiled queen to a political powerhouse by the fall of 1326, and she was getting ready to depose the King of England. Accompanied by Roger Mortimer, she obtained financial support, troops from French nobility who sympathized with her, and pledges of assistance from disgruntled English lords. Young Edward of Windsor, her son and the legitimate heir to the kingdom, was at the heart of their cause. The campaign as a whole appeared more legitimate because of his presence. It wasn't just a queen exacting revenge, it was a mother returning the crown to its rightful place in the future. Isabella and Mortimer began their assault in 1327, bringing a small army to the Suffolk coast. However, their momentum more than made up for their shortage of numbers. They experienced less opposition as they progressed. Weary of royal mismanagement and Despenser oppression, the English welcomed them. Many knights and nobles defected. Isabella's bet had paid off, and the political tide had turned. With Hugh Despenser, Edward II went west after being deserted by many of his followers. However, their withdrawal was brief. Forces loyal to Isabella captured them in the vicinity of Neath, Wales. Hugh Despenser the Younger was tried for treason, and the king was placed in prison. His harsh and quick execution was meant to mark the end of a period of corruption. Now that the Despensers were gone and Edward was being watched, Isabella had to answer a challenging question. How should a live king be handled? Deposition was uncommon, but it had precedent. Edward II was formally compelled to abdicate in January 1327 in favour of his 14-year-old son, who is now Edward III. Although the coronation was conducted with dignity, the true authority was evident. In the name of the young monarch, Isabella governed England as regent alongside Mortimer. It was a remarkable turn. An entire kingdom was now ruled by a woman who had previously been marginalized and degraded, but there were risks associated with winning. Once acquired, power needs to be held on to. Isabella had deposed one king, but now she had to deal with the scrutiny and expectations of a whole realm. Isabella of France became the most influential political figure in England when Edward II abdicated. Edward III, her son, was still a boy, even though he had been anointed king. As regent, Isabella shared power with Roger Mortimer, her close friend and supporter. Collectively, they wielded royal authority with a degree of dominance that matched that of kings in every way save title. Isabella's regency was welcomed at first. Both nobles and commoners found relief in the removal of the dispensers, and optimism was given by the prospect of stability under her direction. She implemented changes, overturned illegal land grabs, and gave back titles to people who had been disinherited during Edward II's reign. Her early choices were reasonable and well considered, and she gained a lot of favor. However, criticism started to emerge over time. Now the Earl of March, Mortimer, accumulated considerable riches and power. He assumed control of royal castles, was bestowed with extravagant land grants, and began acting more and more like a king in all but name. Many started to perceive in Mortimer the same unbridled partiality that had characterized the reign of Edward II. Once regarded as a representation of justice, Isabella was now charged with excess and pleasure. Many of the properties and wealth that were seized from her husband's erstwhile associates were kept by her. Excessive spending and lavish presents to French family members fueled animosity, particularly at a time when the monarchy was still healing from war and political turmoil. The uncomfortable presence of the overthrown king added to the atmosphere. Rumor had claimed that Edward II was still alive in captivity despite his abdication. Suspicions and conspiracy theories were sparked by this shadow over Isabella's reign. Once grounded in justice, her legitimacy now hung precariously on the precipice of public opinion. Edward III was becoming older and keeping a close eye on things, which added complexity. As he approached manhood, the boy king started to see how powerful Mortimer was and how dependent his own mother was on her companion. What had started out as a regency was starting to resemble a regime. Isabella had declared triumph, but it would be riskier to hang on to power than to take it. Soon, the queen who had overthrown a king would have to deal with the difficulty of ruling without turning into the very thing she had destroyed. Edward III was 17 years old by 1330, no longer a boy, and he was not satisfied with having his kingdom run in his name. Even though he had been proclaimed king 3 years prior, Isabella and Roger Mortimer still held the true power and proceeded to govern England with ever-increasing audacity. Isabella was steadfast in her support of Mortimer, who had become conceited and had taken on the perks of kingship without the title. However, none realized how rapidly the tide was shifting. Once appreciative of the removal of the dispensers, the nobility now looked down on Mortimer. He made a lot of enemies because of his amassing fortune and land, his severe treatment of his opponents, and his pivotal involvement in both internal and foreign affairs. Behind the scenes, young Edward started to rally people who wanted Mortimer's influence to end and the king to finally take full control. Edward's covert coup attempt in the fall of 1330 was a watershed. He sneaked a small number of close allies into Nottingham Castle when he was staying there by using a secret entrance. They took Mortimer into custody without a fight during the night. It was a quick, covert, and decisive operation. Early the next morning, Isabella was arrested. She avoided public disgrace and received respectful treatment, but her authority was promptly taken away. Mortimer, however, was put on trial for treason. He was found guilty on charges of authority abuse, illegal enrichment, and royal manipulation. Edward ordered his execution in spite of Isabella's fervent requests. In November 1330, Mortimer was executed at Tyburn. Mortimer's downfall allowed Edward III to fully assert his claim to the throne. In addition to restoring confiscated lands and assuring the nobility that England was once again under legitimate royal rule, he disassociated himself from the excesses of the regency. Isabella's destiny was more convoluted. She had orchestrated a regency and assisted in overthrowing a king, but Edward preferred mercy to punishment. She was not publicly exiled or put in jail by him. Rather, he permitted his mother to retire far from the power center she formerly held, away from the court and away from politics. Though subdued, the she-wolf had not been annihilated. Isabella of France was no longer a queen in authority, following the dramatic downfall of Roger Mortimer and the full ascension of Edward III, but she still had some protection because she was the king's mother. Edward permitted Isabella to leave public life in relative comfort, rather than imprison her or bring her into public disgrace. It was a modest departure from the stage she formerly ruled, but it was exile even though it wasn't punishment in the conventional sense. In Norfolk, Isabella made her home at Castle Rising, a fortified manor house encircled by expansive lands. She was somewhat gently watched over there. She was no longer politically influential, but she kept some of her wealth and prestige. Without her, the court continued on, and her name gradually disappeared from chronicles and royal decrees. The lady who had used force and desire to govern England now lived in a world of servants, gardens, and quiet. Isabella was not completely abandoned in spite of her retreat from authority. Her son Edward and other family members paid her frequent visits, making sure she was comfortable. According to records, she ran her own little court and participated in charitable work, religious devotion, and art patronage. But there was still controversy around her reputation. She was seen by some as a queen deceived by fate. She was perceived by others as a traitor who had gone beyond the limits of royal etiquette. Isabella's retreat was actually a relief as well as a loss. Her removal might have saved her from the fate that many others in comparable situations had experienced, as the political environment she had formerly maneuvered through with such accuracy had turned against her. She lived unlike Mortimer. She maintained her dignity unlike Edward II. She was able to rewrite the last pages of her life in contemplation rather than revolt during her silent exile. Isabella was at Castle Rising for more than 20 years. She saw her son develop into one of England's most renowned and powerful kings, and she outlived many of her adversaries. However, she never went back to court or participated in statecraft or policy again. She had entered history with rage and intelligence. She waited for it to calm down now. The life of Isabella of France was characterized by abrupt changes: queen, exile, regent, and revolutionary. She had a ferocious reputation for her political savvy and unwavering resolve, which was reflected in her moniker, the She-Wolf of France. However, a simple name does not adequately capture the complexity of her legacy. A princess who was ahead of her time, Isabella used her connections and intelligence to change the course of kingdoms, rather than allowing herself to be marginalized. In an uncommon and contentious step in medieval Europe, her actions resulted in her husband Edward II being deposed. She changed the monarchy and questioned gender norms in the process. Even in a society where men predominated, her regency proved that a queen could exercise power successfully. She skillfully handled foreign politics, dealt with nobility, and maintained relationships. After years of instability, Isabella's first rule provided much-needed stability, even though her alliance with Roger Mortimer ultimately led to her downfall. Nevertheless, history has frequently seen her negatively. Numerous chroniclers emphasized her personal relationships and goals over her political accomplishments, portraying her as cunning and cruel. The prejudices of their era, which found it difficult to balance strong female leadership with medieval conceptions of womanhood, are reflected in these depictions. However, contemporary historians have started to re-evaluate Isabella's contribution, acknowledging her as a significant figure in the changing European scene of the 14th century. Her narrative illuminates the intricacies of gender, power, and surviving at a time of upheaval. It also shows how difficult it was for a queen to strike a balance between her family's allegiance and her civic obligations. Isabella's life was a story of personal sacrifice that went beyond politics. Once a political alliance, her marriage turned into a source of misery and treachery. For a woman who once rocked countries, her exile was a quiet conclusion, yet she persevered. as a representation of tenacity, drive, and the unwavering pursuit of justice in a world that was stacked against her. Isabella's reputation endures not only in history books but also in popular culture. Despite being reviled and feared, the she-wolf is still unquestionably one of the most intriguing characters in medieval history. The political unrest that had previously characterized Isabella of France's life was absent from her last years. She dedicated her life to charitable work, religious reflection, and upholding the dignity of her home while residing at Castle Rising in Norfolk. She was still a significant character, a royal mother, a previous ruler, and a woman who dared to question kings, even though her reign as queen and regent was over. She continued to have a cordial but aloof relationship with her son, Edward III. Edward was firmly established as one of England's most powerful kings by the time of her death in 1358. He had guided the nation into a new period, increased English territory, and restored the crown's authority. Despite Isabella's withdrawal from public life, her influence persisted throughout Edward's rule. Isabella's narrative is one of survival and metamorphosis in addition to scandal and rebellion. She negotiated a perilous environment of shifting allegiances, treachery, and expectations for ladies of royal ancestry. Her capacity to exercise authority, frequently against the wishes of the men in her immediate vicinity, permanently altered the course of English and French history. Originally meant as a word of mockery, her nickname, the She-Wolf of France, has come to represent her political savvy and strong determination. Isabella's legacy questioned modern ideas about women's meekness and frailty. She proved that a woman might play a pivotal role in history by using both will and strategy, even in the strict hierarchies of medieval society. Isabella is regarded as a fascinating and multifaceted person today. Her life raises issues that are relevant much beyond her own era, including those of gender, power, and agency. She was a mother who protected her son's reign, a queen who endured exile but never faded into obscurity, and a monarch whose tale still captivates historians and storytellers. Isabella of France's life ultimately served as a monument to tenacity and the legacy of a queen who made history in spite of overwhelming odds. Her narrative serves as a reminder that every great leader has a complicated personal backstory filled with tragedy, ambition, and the pursuit of power.